So I have the honor of introducing our first speaker, Jennifer Trask. And Jennifer and I just met yesterday. So I'm introducing her, luckily, because I think there are some things that are oftentimes too personal to tell someone face to face. You have to get up and say it in front of an entire audience. When I was a student at the University of Washington in the metalsmithing program in 2004, I had just switched from studying science. I was angry that they wouldn't let me be in the lab the whole time, that I had to also take tests. And so after I found the metalsmithing program, I decided that this was the place that I could be in the lab the whole time. But I didn't quite yet know what kind of work to make or where I belonged in this world. Later, it was, I think, 2 years later, I went to my first SOFA show in New York, Sculptural Object Functional Art show in New York, and I saw Jennifer Trask's work. And the work that she presented there and the relationship it has to the preservation of beauty in the natural world, a touch of violence, a touch of death, really resonated with me. And the way that I perceived that she works with this sort of scientific mindset made me understand that there were people in this field that thought the same way that I think I thought then, and I maybe still think now, although all of that is still changing. So it's a very great honor. I should mention that Jennifer just told me that she is going to be in a show with 4 people at the Renwick Gallery at the Smithsonian Gallery, the Smithsonian Museum of Art. It's not just a museum of art, is it? Anyway, the Museum of the Renwick in DC. Okay, I ran out. I totally ran out. This is it. I should have stopped 5 seconds ago. So she's going to be in a show at the Renwick in 2016. Herself and 3 others, an extraordinary exhibition that she was just invited to participate in. So watch out for that and maybe plan a trip to DC accordingly. Anyway, thank you. And Jennifer, please.
Thank you. I don't know how many of you know this, but I was supposed to be here last year, and something came up, and it was very last minute, and Abby and Kirk and everybody else had to scramble and find someone to do a lecture that day. Obviously, it wasn't a problem. I'm sure you had a wonderful symposium, but thank you for inviting me again. I appreciate it. What's that? Oh. All right, stop it. You're all gonna make me cry. Cut it out. Oh, look, there's a picture. So, I've been working for a while. I've been making jewelry since 1996. No, I'm sorry, 1990. Oh boy, it goes further back than that. 1989. I was at Mass Art. But I've always made work that isn't jewelry as well. Maybe with some of the same sensibilities. I wasn't sure what to focus on coming here, so it's going to be a little bit of both. I'm going to give you, hopefully not a completely dry and boring chronology, but work within the last 10 years. It's changed radically, and most recently I'm focused on sculpture. And I think a lot of you here are artists. Can I see hands? How many of you are artists? Oh yeah. Okay. So a lot of you understand that the working process isn't necessarily linear, that you find something you're interested in and you focus on it in one particular way for a while. Ooh, the room just faded, or is that me? I am jet lagged. And then you focus on a particular concept or something that's of interest to you, and then you you work in a particular genre or with a particular material, and then you move on for a little while. That leads you somewhere else. But inevitably, you come back to those original concepts, that original passion, that original interest. Do you think that's fair to say? Yeah? No? All right, cool. We agree. That's me. About 15 years ago. Does anybody see what's wrong with that? What's that? Really skinny. Yeah, I was hungry. This X-ray was taken because I was having, I had pneumonia, but what stuck with me was the curve, the scoliosis. And I promise I'll get onto images in a second. This is all relevant. So I was asking the technician, can I have an extra copy? And he said, no, we can't give you extra copies of X-rays. This is expensive. But he got frustrated with me because he said, you're not standing up straight. And he kept straightening me out and taking more pictures. So there ended up being extras anyway. And I took them home, and I was fascinated. It left me with this sort of tinge of melancholy. You know that feeling when you wake up from a dream and you have that emotional sort of hangover? Some people know what I'm talking about, yeah. So that's also the same image. I've just put it on top of a window, and I've just tweaked the color. And it's in front of the window, there's trees, or behind the window, there's all these trees. And I saw structure and growth patterns and connectedness to all living organisms. Are you familiar with the as above, so below concept from alchemy? Yeah. So that's the leaping off point. And this is probably about 2005, so about 10 years ago. I didn't do anything directly with this image or these feelings I had about them at first, but you start seeing things. Once you notice something, you see it everywhere. So this is a wax model from La Specola in Florence. If you haven't been there, it's an amazing, amazing museum. All these wax models, really grotesque. So that's a nervous system. But I see other things. I see plant life. And of course, I continued to see these things and look for them, seek them out. So I call this one anatomy as botany. These are, well, it says right there, eye cells, but don't they look like plants? I see plants. So all this information just getting stuffed in here, and I'm starting to figure out what to do with it. And I think at first, we all do this. It's very literal. It's very direct. So these are marine cells that you find in water. You actually don't find them unless you have a really high-powered microscope, but they're in the water. Next time you go swimming, think about that. So this was some of the work that resulted from all of this gathering. These are called radiolarians. They're about 4 inches in diameter. In the center are clusters of glass eyes, taxidermy eyes. To me, they look like cells, individual cells. And then the framework is steel, and then there's stones, and these are brooches. They're very wearable. And I think of these guys as representing the ability of nature to adapt and evolve in any circumstance. This is another piece from 2007. I call it Root Tangle. And you can see that the roots are, they don't really look like roots. They're sort of the same ornamental structure from the other brooches. But they're starting to fall apart and move as if on their own. And the top is, those are snake bones, and there's a glass eye in there, crushed carnelian. On the right, there's hair from a Victorian mourning brooch, except I took it apart and I added more hair. There's hair from a redhead, a blonde, there's gray hair. I started to make my own hybrids in a way. And so the ornamental structure is giving way to these hybrids, and it's flora, it's fauna, it's mineral, it's all of these things. Still don't really know what I'm doing. And it's this one's about 6 inches long. It's a brooch. Any guess as to decade? I'm asking, no, really. That's right. You can tell from the color of the film, right? Yeah. I began collecting things from a very early age. And that's my grandparents' pond right there. Or my grandparents lived on a pond. They didn't actually own the pond, but in my mind, at 8 years old, I thought it was their pond. And I would go out there, and I'm sure I had some poor minnow or something in that bucket. It was years later when I was doing this work that I started to think about why the water really was that color, by the way. I did take a lot of the red out of this film, but the water had that funny reddish tinge. On the other side of the pond was a commercially owned cranberry bog, owned by Ocean Spray. And they sprayed fertilizers and pesticides. And every once in a while, the water from the cranberry bog would wash through this culvert and into the pond, and it would turn the pond funny colors, and things would die. I would find these little crayfish. And at the time, I had no understanding of the notion of malignancy, but they had these funny little growths on their sides. And they were blue and yellow, and I knew something was wrong, but I just was fascinated by it. So it struck me while I'm working now in the mid-2000s that these things were dying, that this was poison. This pond was being poisoned. And then a minute or 2 minutes later, it hit me, wait a minute, I was in that water. My sister, my cousins. And that moment, that gap, that's really important. Because I think for a lot of us, we see ourselves as separate from whatever it is that we do to the environment, whatever we put out there, whatever products we use. Now, I think that's changing, but that notion has informed a lot of my work. Okay, this is a list of plants and what minerals or metals they absorb. Just a partial list. More research, a little shocking. So all of us absorb from our environment, which led to the next body of work. And I'm showing you multiple definitions because each of them is true, each meaning. So I call these flourish, unnatural histories, and these are botanicals that they're public domain botanicals that I redrew. These are encaustic panels, so that's encaustic wax. And then there's a brooch on the upper left that you can remove. And the leaves that you see coming out at the bottom, they're made out of lead. And the brooch itself, it's still, stones. It's moonstones and gold, and there are snake bones, but there's also lead embedded. This is another one. And what started happening here are the frames. I'm just getting these frames at junk shops, but if you look closely, you'll see that there's sort of botanical imagery, and I'm starting to play with that, just not really consciously, just a pure formal response. Oh, and the brooch on the right, I think you can see it pretty clearly on the panel. That has teeth from various rodents. This is a brooch about 5.5 inches across. I call it posy, and those are snake vertebrae, and that's silver. So I'm making this body of work, and it's only after I finish this body of work that I realize that I've been using bone, teeth, or pre-ban ivory in each piece. I've been collecting things, I've been gathering, but no real awareness of why I'm drawn to these particular materials. So I start researching bone. And what I found was a really wonderful a space for metaphor. So bones are both they're the ultimate expression of physical sensation and emotional sentiment. You say, I feel it in my bones, I'm bone weary. It's the thing that's left behind. It shows traces of how you worked, what you ate, what injuries or illnesses you might have had. There's a tremendous amount of information there. But we also think about bone, for the most part, unless you've been injured and you really have had to think about it, as a sort of non-organic thing, a non-living thing, a solid. But it's an organ, and it's completely reinventing itself constantly and incorporating whatever you come in contact with. It's absorbing metals, chemicals, you name it. So in a way, our experiences and the things that we come in contact with are stored. They bind in our bones like an obscure memento. And I found a lot of space for metaphor. So again, I was very direct about my approach. I just dove right in and said, all right, what would it look like? What would it look like if you could see with a microscope these materials bound to your bones? So these are brooches. They're all about 4 or 5 inches long, just straight slab of cow bone. And I've inlaid copper, iron, zinc, lead. And so initially I was thinking, what would it look like? But then what else? What else could we be carrying in our bones? What if we could see concepts and ideals, not just the objective physicality? What if we could see things we unconsciously strive for, mandates we live by? Would you wear those things for other people to see? I call this calibrate brooch, and this is a pretty big piece. It's about 6 inches long, maybe 1.5 inches wide. There's part of a steel ruler on the end, and then lead is inlaid on the top in the shape of an X-ray of my hand. So another motivating force. Why? Besides fascination with things, why? People always ask me, why? What does it mean? Why do you do that? And there's another question they always ask, but we'll get to that. So I'm going to read you a quote. I promise I'll only read a couple. But I became very curious about what was generating this passion, or how did it function? This is from a book that I recommend to anyone. It's called Wonders in the Order of Nature, written by Lorraine Daston and Catherine Park, and it's dense. You could hurt somebody with it, like the phone book trick, but it's really worth looking at. As theorized by medieval and early modern intellectuals, wonder was a cognitive passion, as much about knowing as about feeling. To register wonder was to register a breached boundary, a classification subverted, the making and breaking of categories, sacred and profane, natural and artificial, animal, vegetable, mineral, sublunar and celestial. The ultimate act of cognition, underpinning all pursuit of regularities and discovery of causes. The passion of wonder had a mixed reception among late medieval and Renaissance natural inquirers, scorned by some as a token of ignorance and praised by others, following Aristotle, as the beginning of philosophy. All, however, agreed that wonder was not simply a private emotional experience, but rather, depending on context, a prelude to divine contemplation, a shaming admission of ignorance, a cowardly flight into fear of the unknown, or a plunge into energetic investigation. May you all investigate. So the work changed dramatically after, this is 2009. This is a neck piece. I call it Allegory. And this whole time while I'm doing all this research, I'm collecting all these bone bits, natural bits of bone, flea market finds, thrift stores, eBay. I'm collecting whatever I can. And if you look closely at this piece, it's about 36 inches long. It's a pretty big piece. And that's an antler at the top and a little bit of silver wire, but then the rest is all bone and antler. If you look really closely, you see that these pieces, these carved pieces, have carved, a lot of them are floral. In fact, most of the carved bone pieces I found have this sort of incongruous life. I found it very strange, in a material that embodies or at least marks death for a lot of us. Here's this celebration of life. Another neck piece from 2010, it's called Germinate, and what I'm trying to do here is eliminate any use of metal. I want these objects to appear as if they grew, as if they happened. I don't want if there are seams then they have to be part of the piece. It's another view of the same piece. And another aspect of these neck pieces that was very important to me, it's not accidental, is the way they sit on the body. And I do have some photos of them on the body, but they needed to touch bone. They needed to rest on the wearer's bones. I wanted so much to make something that became part of the wearer, or an extension. And this one's called Garland, also from 2010. That's the back. And this is the front. And I understand that these can be viewed as narratives in a way because there's so much imagery, but they're really just aggregates of as many aspects of the natural world as I could get my hands on, but in bone. Oh, and a note about this piece. That's the same piece. The woman that owns it, she doesn't wear it. She uses it, she puts it on a pedestal and has it as a sculpture in her house. And that made me very happy because I think that's really important, that the pieces should stand on their own. So all of this led up to an opportunity with David McFadden. He invited me to participate in a show called Dead or Alive at the Museum of Art and Design in 2010. Did anybody from here see that show? New York, Dead or Alive? No? You did. Now, does everybody have that song stuck in their head? Because I do. So this is the piece that I ended up making. I took he gave me permission to do whatever I wanted, and what I wanted was to make something that was more inclusive and less intimate than jewelry can be. So that's the longest dimension on the frame is probably about 48 inches. And I found the frame when I was trying to figure out what I was going to do for this. And I can't believe my luck. I found it on eBay. It's an 18th century Italian frame, gilded, beautiful condition. I mean, it was heartbreaking for me to actually cut into it. I had a panic attack when I started to carve into it. But what struck me about the frame was these deeply carved and articulated acanthus leaves. And it occurred to me that this frame, once upon a time, was a tree, or many trees. It was this beautiful organic thing that was cut and milled and made into something perfectly flat and controllable, right? And then carved into idealized forms, idealized leaf forms. And this is a very common motif. I did research it. I couldn't find much about, here's another example. That's in Italy on the Duomo. Those are acanthus leaves. I couldn't find any significance. It's just a pattern. But what happened is I had to figure out what I was going to do with this frame, and I imagined originally that it had held a vanitas, a Dutch floral. Does everybody know what a vanitas is? I'm getting blank stares. Okay. It literally translates to emptiness, the hollowness of life. And these paintings were made as sort of warnings, lessons. Don't get too caught up in the hollowness of life and the vanities. These things won't last. And if you look at these paintings, well, we'll get into the paintings in a minute. But anyway, that's what I originally thought that I was going to do with it. But I kept looking at this frame and thinking about these forms and wondering about, well, what if this frame had a cellular memory, implicit memory? What would happen? You know, it's so old. What happens if you leave it in a dark corner somewhere? So why not the fertile matter of decay, a memory of a wilder form? And so that's what happened. I just tried to imagine what this frame might do. What would happen if that painting and that frame got together and had a love child? And here's some studio images. I had no idea how to make flowers out of bone. Not a clue. And that's, you probably recognize Sergey down there. We've shared a studio for years. He's been a part of my work for many, many years now. A collaborator and an instigator and an inspiration. And up there is a former assistant. I'm showing you this because none of these big pieces happened without a whole lot of help. a lot of parts. And I have to give credit to the various interns and assistants I've had. And here you can see pictures of flowers, pieces of bone. We're just collecting whatever I can get my hands on. So, where do you get your bone? It started where I live, because I used to live in the Hudson Valley, and I would find white-tailed deer frequently, or coyotes or raccoons. But once you start making something like this, you need more. Well, guess what? You can buy anything on eBay. Anything. Seriously. But there are clearinghouses too. There are places where trappers and hunters bring the remains. They take what they want, and you can buy fur, teeth, claws, bones, and none of these animals are endangered. I even got a bone from some bones from a zoo. After a giraffe had expired, they sold off the bones. They needed the extra funds, and that giraffe became some work. I'll show you. So these are some close-ups of some of the flowers. There's buffalo teeth, rattlesnake ribs, all kinds of antlers. The ones that look like orchids at the bottom here are from the base of the spine. I mean the base of the skull, where your spine attaches. And when I started looking at these things, again, I started to see what it was that I was looking for. I started seeing flowers. So some of them I didn't alter all that much, but some of them are hundreds of little tiny pieces put together. And that led into the major body of work that I've been focused on now for the last 5 years. And I'm showing you these titles, but they don't all have crisp dividing lines. I mean, it's only in retrospect that I can even name a body of work. It doesn't work that way for me. So I went back to the Vanitas, and I started thinking about how the paintings themselves became an instrument of vanity. People that bought these things were very wealthy. These paintings took a year or more to produce. If you look at the flowers in them, you couldn't find all those flowers in one place. The painters would be commissioned, and then they would have to go to different places at different times and paint these flowers, sketch them, do studies, and then later put them all together. And you can tell sometimes by looking at these paintings, the lighting isn't consistent. I don't know if anyone's looked that closely at Dutch florals. I was at the time also reading a book by George Gessert. He's a bio artist. Has anyone heard of him? George Gessert. He has a book called Green Light, Toward an Art of Evolution. This is from him. Our ornamental plants, pets, sporting animals, and spice plants constitute a vast genetic art, or art involving DNA, in which aesthetic qualities determine survival. Very quietly, hybridizers have become major interpreters of nature, producing organisms that are simultaneously beings and images. So this is my answer to that. This is a Dutch floral. I call this still life, with nest, serpent, and pearls. And you'll see why in a second. But this Vanitas has collapsed. It's disintegrating. And from the leaves, you see growths, you see things sprouting. And the flowers that are coming out are Queen Anne's lace, my interpretation of Queen Anne's lace, which were once cultivated and now considered weeds. This is some Queen Anne's lace. I lived in a place where I found tons of it. And I don't know if you see it, but when I look at those, I see spines, ribs, I see a bone structure. And I started researching the Queen Anne's lace and learned that not only was it cultivated, but the root is edible. The leaves are noxious. And the seeds, if you dry the seeds, many years ago, they were used as birth control. Yeah. So this is the nest that might have been in the painting. Actually, it's 2 nests. So the objects that might have been in this painting have escaped or been removed. I don't really know, but they were displayed separately. So these are nests made out of bone, life size. a tulip made from antler and bone, again, probably 9 or 10 inches long. The pearls, the keys, one of which I'm wearing today. And I just would like to point out that I have done my research and nobody has made a skeleton key out of bone before that I know of. And why? I mean, it just seems so obvious, right? At the same time, I was continuing to make jewelry, and so this is a canthus neck piece, also from 2010. And it evolved at the same time. Now there's bits of these old frames, which I've been collecting. And all I can say about this is that I had the same, so working on something really large, which took many, many months, was mind-blowing. As a jeweler, you're used to a slightly more rapid result, usually. And so I had the need, first of all, to make something more intimate, but something that was tactile, something that you could participate in, where you, the wearer, could actually participate in the art. So again, I want this to be, it's hitting here and back here, and it should be an external appendage of the wearer. That's the same. So this is Swag neck piece. This is from 2011. This is in Helen Drutt's collection. And that's off the body. And then, of course, I needed immediate gratification, so brooches. Lots of little brooches. These are about 4.5, 5 inches. And multiple pieces. Sometimes there's plastic in there, I admit it. It's not all bone. That's a fish fin on the top there. Back to the Queen Anne's lace. I wasn't done with it yet. I kept looking at these plants and thinking about how complex it is, how it has all these beneficial properties and then these toxic properties. And the name, Queen Anne's lace, do you see the little red spot in the middle? Looks like a little drop of blood. According to what I've read, the flower was named after Queen Anne because she liked to tat lace, and that's a drop of her blood. And so that got me thinking more about domestic issues. And so I ended up making these sculptures with sewing needles. I'm going to give you this. It should have been first. These are all steel sewing needles with python ribs. And I like this slide because the shadows sort of imply a root system, something going on underneath. Really? Are you blushing? I hope you are. Okay, thank you. Has anyone heard of Forbes Watson? Anyone? Yeah, kind of an obscure Victorian writer, a naturalist. He wrote something called Flowers and Gardens, and he talked about how if you really love flowers and plants, that you shouldn't just display them when they're in full bloom and then cut them down. The whole life cycle is beautiful. The complete cycle is something to be enjoyed, admired, appreciated. And so this is my naturalized garden, and I apologize, I don't know why this one's so blown out, but they're in different growth phases. Some are closed, like buds, some are more open. And there's another close-up. Some of the pieces that I was doing at the time were just freestanding flowers. They were, right. Are you guys trying to tell me something? I was doing these separate single pieces, these flowers, and I wanted very much to stay within the realm of the research I was doing. I was trying to stay authentic. And so I had these tags that I made, they're bone, and laser etched with the species name, the family name, but I would alter them, of course. I'd have to have fun, like I'd call something calciflora, which isn't a real name, but it's calcium and flora, yeah. I had to name my specimens. I'm continuing to look at all these crazy flowers. Here's another really chilling fact. At the time that I read this statistic, which was probably mid-2000 or late 2000, the number of new ornamental cultivars, and cultivars are plants that cannot exist without our intervention. They're plants that we have to grow, clone, nurture. They outnumber food crops 8-1. Let that sink in. Go to a greenhouse and look at all the flowers that you can buy, and then the vegetables. Yeah. I'm sure it's changed since then. I'm happy when I see my heirloom varieties available, but still. Along with the peony, chrysanthemums have been described in writings as far back as 15th century BC in China. All parts of the plant, petals, stems, leaves, roots, were used in medicine, but they also became sort of a trophy item. Really fed this craving that we all have, I think, for new, the rare, the unusual. And I get a thrill from these bizarre varieties of flowers that you've never seen before. Whoa, isn't that weird? Like lady slipper orchids, they're so creepy. They look like aliens, but I love them. So this is an actual chart from the National Chrysanthemum Society. Rarities, double blossoms, for instance, or unusual colors, you could see them as representing security and abundance, wealth, skill, or sensuality. But you can also see them as disturbing and repulsive in terms of the facts that they're inviable, infertile, or redundant. And maybe the beauty, the attraction, is that tension in balance. This is from a show, I think it's the Brooklyn Botanical Gardens. New York City Botanical Gardens, yeah, those are all chrysanthemums. Check these out. Another quote from George Gessert. Certain kinds of uselessness free our minds. The wonder of things in themselves confirms the goodness of being. One of the great unacknowledged forces of domestication today may be a hunger for abundant uselessness. So this is my answer to that. This is Abundant Uselessness, 2011. It's about 26 by 27. Found frame, bone, antler. The flower on the right, that blossom on the right, that's made with beaver teeth and cow bone. And it's about this big, and it probably has about 400 separate pieces in it. The cultivated notion of nature is no longer separable from authentic, because seeds, genomes, pollen, they all migrate. There's no clear line anymore. And we've learned that genetically altered domesticated plants are far from harmless, I think, in recent years. All of this work points to this sort of curatorial oversight that we have. And we've done this for a long time, we humans. This is chrysanthemum. It's type 11, if you go back to that chart. I don't know if anyone remembers. These are rattlesnake ribs. So the petals themselves each are rattlesnake ribs that have been soaked in vinegar and softened, and then the ends have been curled and dried. Again, a few hundred pieces in each blossom. The stem is antler, and then there's fragments of some of those old frames. That's a close-up. And then the work got even bigger. This is Burgeon. This one's about 7.5 feet. And this is my naturalized garden. The growth goes from left to right. You start with fairly recognizable flowers, and then they get less and less recognizable and more spooky. Here's a close-up at the very top. That large white piece there, that's not even really, I call it a flower. It's the base of a steer skull. It's 1/4. What I also found looking at all these bones is that, there's only so many forms. There's only so many structures. And these curves, these compound curves, they are flowers. If you separate them, if you isolate them, they're just as beautiful, and you can create a flower. And that's the far left corner. Carved camel bone, more beaver teeth. Okay, so this is this most recent show. This is where I'm at now. This was a show at Lisa Seti Gallery. And these are 3 separate pieces. Can you read those little notes? No, it's too small. Okay, I wasn't sure. This one I call Encroachment. It's about, well, it tells me exactly, 32 inches by 24, and it's about 7 deep. Gold leaf, gesso, frame fragments, and I reconstructed this frame. It didn't exist like this. There isn't. You wouldn't find one like this. The front is what they call a Roman coin pattern, and it was all in pieces. And I'll show you a close up. But it was in 5 fragments, and I reassembled it, and then I built a cove molding sort of frame around it, so it was like a shadow box. And this piece satisfied my urge to work with 2 and 3 dimensions. There's a painter in me somewhere, and I really enjoyed this piece. I really enjoyed working on the finishing. Let me get you closer. So there's all kinds of bone fragments, teeth, and then that background is a botanical that I painted. I want it to appear to be a decayed painting, a painting that's slowly crumbling. And all I've used is calcium carbonate, bone black, which is just bone black, burnt calcium, mica, and a little bit of varnish. And then if you look at the very top there, can you see that little stripe across the edge of the frame? Or maybe over here on the right, there's a diagonal stripe. Those are the places where the frame was broken. And instead of hiding that, I highlighted that. And I used something that I found as a curious sort of remnant from working with these bones. To shape some of the smaller bones, the thinner bones, I would put them in vinegar, and I would get this residue. I mean, you'd have to do this for weeks or months to get some of these bones flexible. And you get this funny, glittery white residue at the bottom of the containers. And it was rigid but crumbly. And it was basically pure calcium, because the acid acts on the phosphates and separates the calcium from the collagen, and I'm sure I'm getting it wrong, but something like that. Anyway, I had this wonderful residue left. So I used everything. I mean, this is part of my practice as well. I use every bit that I bring into that studio. There's nothing that is wasted. This is all a sort of form of recycling for me. So on the right-hand side, where you see that funny cluster, I wish it was sharper. I wish you could see. That is calcium. That is the residue. And I mix that with the resin to bind the frame back to itself. And there's also some druzy quartz in there, because, you know, I'm still a jeweler. Landscape. This is also from 2014. Thank you. This is about 5.5 feet long. And here's another view. This is cast resin with a lot of bone bits and antlers that have been spliced together. And this is something I didn't tell you about the necklaces. They're all spliced together with maybe 8 or 9 different antlers. And I try to make them as fluid and directional as possible. So here's what I think triggered this piece. This is in France. Very ancient. I can't even tell you where I was, or it was just south of France. And if you look really closely on the right, you see all these bricks and different kinds of stone. I was really fascinated with the way we build on the bones of older civilizations. How you don't know here what's original and what's added necessarily, unless you're a scientist. And the original is just no longer discernible. So these last few pieces, and I promise there's just a few, really, for me, brought together the notion of growth and decay. This is a corner piece. This is about 5 feet tall. I call this efflorescence. in sections, but it's probably closer to 6 feet, and it's in a 90-degree corner. Again, all the same materials. This is the front view, so if you're looking straight at it, you're up against the wall, that's how it appears. But from the other wall, it appears more, it has more volume. And really, I should have photographed it on a white wall because I'm also referring to the fact that calcium, it's a building block everywhere. It's our bones, it's in eggshells, it's seashells. We need it for our body, our synapses to work properly. We also use it in our physical structures, plaster walls. I mean, I see this continuity with this material. And this is a caliper made out of a turkey wishbone, and this was a collaboration with Sergei Chevetin. This last couple of pieces I like to call quantifying intangibles. I think this is where I'm headed next. Contemplating the idea that there are certain things that you can only measure with devices that have no name, that have no function. That's as much as I can tell you. And this one's called suture. That's the front and the back. It's about that big. And it's a play on an embroidery hoop. And the top of it, there are 4 skull fragments from white-tailed deer. And there's those sutures, those funny little lines. Oops, sorry. And they're sewn with gold thread. I've taken actual gold thread and stitched through. But the question is it being unraveled or is it being put together? I don't really know. And the writing on the top here, it's probably very hard to read. It says, Devo fermi la ossa. Does anyone know what that means? Anyone speak Italian? It's an idiom. It's, I need to make my bones. But what it really means is I need to be true to myself. So I'm going to leave you there. I'm going to say thank you. Hope that you have some questions. Well, the first question I always get is, where do you get your bones? But I already answered that, so.
Isn't there a law that says you can't use wild bones? You must know about that. What is it?
Is there a law that says I can't use wild animal bones? There are certain species, yes, like songbirds, you can't hang on to or touch. But there's nothing pertaining to white-tailed deer, cow. It depends on the type of animal. Way up there.
How are you building the pieces? How are you putting them together?
If I told you.
I won't tell a soul.
A lot of different ways. One of the things that I use that I'm not too pleased with myself about is epoxy resin. Yeah, I wish there was a better alternative, but right now that's what there is. So a lot of the bigger pieces are pinned together with brass pins. So there's a mechanical joint, and then I color match the resin. I add bone powder and try to blend it. There's a lot of illusion going on.
Do you just shape the bone or do you carve it?
It depends on the bone. So some heavier bones, you can't really bend them. It's only the thinner stuff, like a scapula. I should have said that. The tulip was made from scapula, from raccoons or coyote, and it's so thin that you can soak that in vinegar, and over the course of weeks it'll get soft, and then you can bend it. Or if I take like cow bone and you slice it into, using a lathe, cut thin slices, then I can soak that and it will get flexible. But most of it's too rigid, so there's a lot of carving, and it's more additive than subtractive. Working with bone is really nasty. It's smelly, it's messy. So you want to do as little subtractive as you can. Over there.
I know a lot of the work you show spends a lot of time, but how much of it did you do with your hands and how much was done by assistants?
How much of this work was done with my hands and how much was done by assistants? With the bigger pieces over the last few slides, I always have assistants helping me, but I always work on the pieces too. And I'm the first one and the last one to touch that piece. I mean, there's a time at the end where I say, okay, everybody out, and I need to be alone with that piece and work with it. But to make, well, for example, like this, there's thousands of little pieces that had to be cut and put together. And when I'm putting them together, there's resin that needs to be cleaned up. So that's where the assistants come in. They help me manufacture the parts and the cleanup. Yes. But, well, power tools as well, but but sometimes it's, I mean, I get as detailed in this work as I would with a brooch, or I can't stand it if there's one little inconsistency. Maybe over there.
What's the best way, your bones are very white, or
Okay.
green colored, but there's also sometimes required to color bone a little deeper than what it is. So what's the best way to color bone, or how do you get yours with that?
How do I get mine white, and how do you color bone? Yeah, I don't color it. I rarely, I mean, I might obscure it with gold leaf occasionally to make it blend in with another part of the piece. The whiteness, I use 100% hydrogen peroxide, which is extremely caustic. You have to be careful with it, gloves, mask, lab gear. And you soak it, and then you just put it out in ultraviolet light, and that will whiten the bone, disinfect it, will kill any biological matter without weakening it. Way up there. Ah, you're one of those that sees faces everywhere. No, I wasn't intending to create faces, and I don't see them, but I'm not sure I want you to point them out to me. No, I'm not looking. Oh, God. That ruined everything for me. Oh, thank you. Oh, there's a couple more. Oh, there are definitely some human bones I'd like to use, but it's illegal. I have a great idea for a TV show. Involves a homicidal artist, her ex-husband. You have a question?
Yeah, I was wondering about your documentation. So, you're showing these things in sort of a space, like on a neutral background. Sometimes you're showing them on a plastic body. Sometimes you're showing them on a person's body. Sometimes you have them, sort of annotated with what the materials are. How do you feel about your documentation? Like, what are you happy about? Like, do you ever want to go back and re-document?
Oh, yeah. Well, here's the thing that I think a lot of us run into. You finish a piece and you're fighting a deadline. You're racing against a deadline, and you do whatever you can, and then you've got to send it out. There are definitely pieces I'd like to reshoot. The mannequin was simply because I didn't have time or a model available. I do 90% of the photography myself. So then the gray is a result of just wanting consistency. I learned a long time ago that if you're going to show your work together in any sort of a group, in a book or whatever, that it's better to have some sort of consistent background. I like seeing the neck pieces, the jewelry on a model, but for me it's not necessary. I like them as objects, so I hope that somewhat answers the question. Kind of. Okay. Yes. So I should have mentioned that, and I apologize. How did the necklaces function? How do you get them on? They There are multiple pieces of antler that have been spliced together, and they can open, they can swivel. There are many, many joints, and you can pull them apart. They're hidden barrel hinges. Yeah, exactly. And let me tell you, when they don't work, it's a nightmare to get back in there.
This will be our last question.
Okay.
So the other part Can you talk about that a little bit?
If I knew what this was, I wouldn't keep trying to make work. Yeah. Thank you. I have to relinquish the stage. Thank you.
Knock that apart.